When you hear someone describe themselves as a socialist today, you would expect them to be on the left. You would be right to assume that they support the collective ownership of the means of production, end of wage labour, end of commodity production, end of private property, and the destruction of the pro-capitalist state. Indeed, the common goal of left-wing socialist groups in the latter half of the 19th century was to replace capitalism with a classless and stateless society where the means of production would be collectively owned and controlled. However, the left-wing socialists were not the only groups that wanted to replace capitalism. The former rulers of society, the aristocracy, wanted to return to the feudal economic system where they held all the power. Friedrich Engels, in his book The Principles of Communism, describes these feudalists as reactionary socialists. To quote Engels directly on reactionary socialism, "It seeks to establish the rule of the aristocracy, the guildmasters, the small producers, and their retinue of absolute or feudal monarchs, officials, soldiers, and priests, a society which was, to be sure, free of the evils of present-day society, but which brought it at least as many evils without even offering to the oppressed workers the prospect of liberation through a communist revolution." Engels concludes, "As soon as the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their true colours by immediately making common cause with the bourgeoisie against the proletariat." Just to be clear, these reactionaries, identified as members of the Young England sect of the British Conservative Party and the French Legitimists, never described themselves as socialists. However, during the early 20th century, the term socialism started to be embraced by the conservative right, especially in Germany. Oswald Spengler, the most prominent member of the German conservative revolutionary movement, used the term Prussian socialism to describe the so-called unique socialism of the Germans. In his book, Prussianism and Socialism, which was published in 1920, Spengler argues that King Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, and Otto von Bismarck were great socialists. Marxism, by contrast, is described as the capitalism of the working class. Spengler believed that a great socialist revolution had taken place in Germany in 1914, where all classes, whether they be the landowners, the industrialists, or workers, had united in order to defeat the enemies of the German state. In Spengler's view, the other great socialist revolutions in German history took place under similar circumstances. He gives the example of the War of German Liberation from Napoleon's domination in 1813, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where all the German states united to crush the Second French Empire. So to Spengler, Prussian socialism was about the entire nation working towards a common goal in order to advance the interests of the nation. He argued that the rich, those who owned the means of production, and the workers should all regard themselves as servants of the state. A wealthy German should not have the same mindset as a wealthy Englishman or a wealthy Frenchman. In Spengler's eyes, the Englishman had the mindset of a pirate or a Viking. What Spengler meant by this is that the English, just like those who used to engage in piracy, just care about their individual loot, and he had the same criticisms of Marxism. To quote Spengler, "The trick about Marx's famous surplus value thesis is that it was considered as spoils to be carried off by the successful merchant from the opponent's stores. It was not to be presented to him for nothing. Class egoism thus becomes a universal principle. The labourers not only wanted to do business, he wanted to corner the whole market. The true Marxist is hostile to the state, and for the very same reason as the Whig. It hinders him in the ruthless exercise of his private business interests. Marxism is the capitalism of the working class." Spengler adds, "Marx wished to deprive capital of the right to private profit, but the only thing he could think of as a substitute was the workers' right to private profit. That is unsocialistic, but it is typically English." To Marx, according to Spengler, socialism was a battle between the good working class and the evil bourgeois. The Marxist concept of socialism was totally adverse to Prussian socialism, which promotes class collaboration and national unity. Under Prussian socialism, everyone is a public servant, whether they are a worker or an employer. To quote Spengler's definition of socialism, the meaning of socialism is that life is dominated not by the contrast of rich and poor, but by rank as determined by achievement and ability. That is our kind of freedom. Freedom from the economic capriciousness of the individual. As you can see already, Spengler's view of socialism is already massively detached from the definitions used by Marx and Proudhon. In fact, this becomes even more clear when Spengler starts talking about property. I quote, "Socialism does not mean nationalization by expropriation or theft. It is not all concerned with nominal property, but rather with the techniques of administration, buying up industries right and left for the sake of some slogan and handing them over to administrative bodies incognizant of the ways of large enterprises instead of leaving them to the responsibility and initiative of their owners is the surest way to pervert true socialism." The old Prussian method was to legislate the formal structure of the total productive potential while guarding carefully the right to property and inheritance, and to allow so much freedom to personal talent, energy, initiative, and intellect as one might allow a skilled chess player who has mastered all the rules of the game. So in Spengler's view, private property as well as private enterprise still exists under Prussian socialism. In fact, he goes as far as saying that the collectivization of private property is theft. However, the Prussian entrepreneur's attitude greatly differs from the attitude of the English Viking/pirate. Whilst the Englishman would see the wealth generated as his private loot, the Prussian entrepreneur would proudly consider his private fortune as a function of the total economic potential of his nation. Spengler advocates a state-directed private economy where the economic will remains as free as that of the chess player, only the end effects follows a regulated course. So Prussian socialism is a form of nationalistic collectivism, where every single person works for the benefit of the state, whether they be the owners of capital or mere workers. So using Spengler's definition, a capitalist like Krupp, the famous arms manufacturer, would be a socialist because he took up the Kaiser's call during the First World War to contribute to the war effort. Workers who chose to strike for better conditions are anti-socialist because they are hurting the national economy. Indeed, workers should treat their employers as authority figures, people of higher rank. Their employers should regard the state as the major authority. So basically, economic activity or any type of activity is based on duty to the state. This is made clear when Spengler compares the soldiers at the front to the Marxist revolutionaries in 1918. He argued that whilst the soldiers at the front were fighting for the Reich, the Marxists were causing trouble on the home front. So to Spengler, the German soldiers at the front were the true socialists, not the Marxists. So Oswald Spengler was attempting to redefine socialism in order to try and lead workers away from Marxism. So Spengler's Prussian socialism was about obedience. If you were a worker, you would be an obedient servant to your employer. If you were an employer or a capitalist, you were to be an obedient servant to the state. Now Spengler was not the only German to have these type of views. In fact, the German writer Werner Sombart adopted such views in the latter years of his life. Now Werner Sombart was once a prominent Marxist and was even praised by Friedrich Engels for his understanding of capital. However, in his later years, he abandoned Marxism and embraced what he called German socialism. Like Spengler's Prussian socialism, Sombart's German socialism preaches nationalistic collectivism. It is both anti-liberal and anti-Marxist, and once again promotes a national interest/national community first mentality. Now the economy under this system would look quite archaic. For one, agriculture, particularly peasant farmers, would be given top priority. Now does this mean that the old German landed gentry, the Junkers, would be forced off their land? No. The priority of Sombart, according to Abram L. Harris, was to simply revive the feudal principle, so the private property of Germany's landed elite would still be respected. When it comes to industry, small businesses were to be promoted over big business. To Sombart, big industry should be regarded as evil, even if under certain conditions a necessary evil. I should point out that I am getting this information from Abram L. Harris's piece, Sombart and German National Socialism. I unfortunately could not find a primary source. Anyway, as you can see, Sombart, even though he was once a convinced Marxist, fully supported a private feudal system where all economic actors direct their actions towards a national goal. Clearly, the word socialism had an entirely different meaning to these rightists than it did to those on the left. The system advocated by Spengler and Sombart was pro-private property, nationalistic, and hierarchical. Now naturally, many writers and thinkers believe that both Spengler and Sombart had a great influence on Hitler's National Socialism. One of these people was the liberal economist Friedrich von Hayek, who wrote about what he called conservative socialists in his famous book The Road to Serfdom. In the chapter entitled The Socialist Roots of Nazism, he writes, "The doctrines which had guided the ruling elements in Germany for the past generation were opposed not to the socialism in Marxism, but to the liberal elements contained in it, its internationalism and its democracy." Now here, Hayek was performing a sleight of hand trick. He knew that these conservatives were utterly opposed to Marxism, but he tried to muddy the waters by claiming that these rightists were fine with the economic aspects of Marxism, but were just against the democracy and internationalism. Utter nonsense. The writers Hayek talks about glorified the year of 1914, the start of the First World War. So the writers were glorifying the Germany of the Kaiser, the Junkers, aka aristocratic landowner/merchant class, and the industrialists. Hayek expects us to believe that these people were fine with the economic aspects of leftist socialism, which calls for democracy, collective ownership of the means of production, and the end of commodity production. Yes, Hayek expects us to believe that the ruling elements in Germany wanted to lose their economic and political power. Utterly ridiculous. As for democracy and internationalism, Spengler and Sombart were both radical nationalists and advocates for a hierarchical dictatorship, so Hayek is right about that part. However, as I have pointed out many times, Hayek himself was no friend of democracy. He supported Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile and Salazar's dictatorship in Portugal. In fact, Hayek stated in 1974, "It may be said that effective and rational economic policies can be implemented only by a superior leader of the philosopher-statesman type, under powerful autocracy." Now the question is, was Hayek correct when he claimed that right-wing socialists like Spengler and Sombart were highly influential on Hitler's National Socialism? Well, in a speech dated July 28, 1922, Hitler stated, "Whoever is prepared to make the national cause his own to such an extent that he knows no higher ideal than the welfare of the nation, whoever has understood our great national anthem, Deutschland über alles, to mean that nothing in the wide world surpasses in his eyes this Germany, people and land, that man is a socialist." End quote. That is Prussian socialism in a nutshell. It is about the so-called national interest as determined by the dictator. It shares no relation to the Marxism and anarchism of the left. In fact, Hitler made it quite clear that he was in favour of private property and entrepreneurship, as explained in an interview in 1923 with the journalist George Sylvester Viereck. Socialism, unlike Marxism, does not repudiate private property. Unlike Marxism, it involves no negation of personality, and unlike Marxism, it is patriotic. This mirrors Spengler's words in Prussianism and socialism. The old Prussian method was to legislate the former structure of the total productive potential whilst guiding carefully the right to property and inheritance, and to allow so much freedom to personal talent, energy, initiative, and intellect as one might allow a skilled chess player who has mastered all the rules of the game. Therefore, Hitler's pro-capitalist policy, such as privatization, does not really contradict Hitler's definition of socialism at all. Krupp, Germany's biggest capitalist, joining the party and making record profits, also does not contradict Hitler's definition. In fact, Krupp, who was also president of Germany's Chamber of Commerce, praise of Hitler would have reflected both Prussian and National Socialist values. To quote a speech made by Krupp on the 18th of October 1933, "To have united the purposes of an entire nation is the great historical achievement of the man in whose strong hand our President has placed the fate of our people." When Reich Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler called the General Council of Economy together for the first time on the 20th of September, I had the honor to thank him for the confidence which he had put in the men of the practical business world by calling them to the General Council. I pledged to him unrestrained support to his government in its exceedingly difficult task from all branches and organizations of economy. Just like Spengler had desired, the capitalists, as well as the German workers, had supposedly united under the German flag in order to drive the national interest forward. This attitude, of course, was reflected by the now discredited slogan, "Germany above all," or Deutschland über alles. Now, what about Sombart's views? Well, Hitler certainly ignored him when it came to industry. Big industry, Flick, IG Farben, Krupp, etc., benefited the most out of Hitler's policies, while small businesses declined. However, the National Socialists did establish the hereditary farm law, legislation designed to preserve the farming community as the blood source of the German people. This was a return to feudalism in this area. The land of German peasant farmers, of so-called Aryan heritage, could not be alienated, liquidated, or sold. These peasant farmlands were turned into hereditary fiefs where the oldest son of the farmer would be the clear inheritor. The Junkers were also able to keep their great landed estates. So as you can see, the word socialism had a totally different meaning to these German rightists. In an utter repudiation of Marx and anarchism, these individuals supported private property, were completely anti-democratic, and demanded that workers blindly follow the orders of their employers. Of course, the supreme authority was given to the state. It was a system of totalitarian, monopolistic capitalism.